Before we begin, if you find yourself intrigued by tales of the strange and the sinister, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more stories that weave history with the uncanny. Tonight, we delve into a time when mirrors were not merely objects of vanity, but feared as gateways to the unknown. Chapter 1. The Sinister Reflection. In the year 1603, in a village so small it barely warranted a name, a man named Elias Whitlock made the grave mistake of purchasing a mirror. It was not an ordinary mirror, though to be fair, no mirror in the 1600s was ever truly ordinary. This one was framed in dark oak, carved with winding vines that seemed to shift under candlelight, and its glass held a peculiar depth, as though it were not reflecting the world so much as peering back into it. The merchant who sold it to Elias had been in a hurry to part with it, his hands trembling as he wrapped it in burlap, his voice dropping to a whisper as he said, "Mind it doesn't face the bed." Elias, being a man of reasonable skepticism, or perhaps just reasonable stubbornness, laughed at the warning. He was a practical man, a cooper by trade, who spent his days shaping barrels and his nights drinking ale. Superstition was for the women who whispered over their laundry, and the priests who thundered from their pulpits. So he hung the mirror in his bedchamber, directly opposite his bed, and thought nothing more of it. That was his first mistake. The second was noticing, 3 nights later, that his reflection seemed to linger a moment too long after he turned away. It was a subtle thing, a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye, but when he turned back, the reflection was as it should be. A tired man with a beard in need of trimming, his shirt unlaced, his expression weary. Elias rubbed his eyes and blamed the ale. By the end of the week, the reflections had grown bold. He would wake in the dead of night to the sound of whispering, only to find his own face in the mirror, mouth moving silently, eyes wide with something like hunger. When he lurched upright, the reflection would settle, but the air in the room would hum, thick with the scent of damp earth and old iron. Elias began sleeping with a knife under his pillow. The village, when he mentioned his troubles, reacted with a mix of pity and terror. Old Widow Hargrove crossed herself and muttered about soul thieves. The blacksmith's wife pressed a sprig of rowan into his hand and told him to burn it before sundown. The priest, a gaunt man with a voice like gravel, demanded to know if Elias had ever seen anything gelsy in the mirror. Anything that wasn't himself. Elias leaned and said no. The truth was, he had. 2 nights prior, he'd awoken to a hand pressed against the inside of the glass. Not a reflection. Not his own. A hand too long, fingers too thin. The nails blackened as though they'd clawed through ash. It had pressed against the surface, leaving no mark, but the glass had grown warm to the touch. Elias had thrown a blanket over the mirror and spent the rest of the night drinking until his hand stopped shaking. Now, as he stood in his bedchamber, the mirror uncovered once more, he wondered if he should have listened to the merchant. The reflection staring back at him was his own, but the eyes were wrong. Darker, dontisel, older. And when he reached out to touch the glass, the reflection smiled. Elias did not smile back. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the village slept, unaware that the worst fears of the 1600s were not witches or plague, but the things that crept through mirrors when no one was watching. Elias, for his part, was watching very, very closely, and the thing in the mirror was watching back. The next morning, the cooper's shop did not open. When the neighbors finally dared to check on Elias, they found his bedchamber empty, the blanket shredded as though by frantic hands, and the mirror now cracked down the center, still hanging on the wall. Of Elias himself, there was no sign. But if you stood very close to the mirror, your breath fogging the glass, you might just hear a faint tapping from the other side. And if you were foolish enough to lean closer, you might hear something else too, a whisper, in a voice almost like your own, saying, "Mind it doesn't face the bed." Chapter 2. The Witch's Glass. In the year 1607, in the damp and mist-laden village of Blackthorn, a woman named Agnes Holloway was accused of witchcraft because she owned a mirror. This was not, strictly speaking, an unusual accusation. By then, mirrors had become suspect objects, their polished surfaces believed to be tools of the devil, capable of trapping souls, summoning demons, and, most damning of all, revealing the future. And if a woman knew the future, well, that was proof enough she had bargained with dark forces. Agnes' mirror was small, no larger than a man's hand, its frame tarnished silver, wrapped in leather. She had inherited it from her mother, who had inherited it from hers, and so on. Back to some forgotten ancestor who had likely bartered for it with a traveling merchant and thought nothing of it. But times had changed. Now, when Widow Parsons' cow went dry, when the miller's son fell ill with a fever no physic could cure, when the harvest failed and the rats grew bold in the churchyard, the villagers looked for someone to blame. And Agnes, with her sharp tongue and solitary habits, was an easy target. The trial was a farce, as these things often were. The magistrate, a man named Harrow with a face like spoiled milk, had already decided her guilt before the first witness spoke. The evidence? The mirror, of course. "Do you deny," Harrow intoned, his fingers steepled, "that this object has been used to commune with spirits?" Agnes, her hands bound in rough rope, stared at him with a weariness that suggested she had expected this for years. "It shows my face," she said. "Nothing more." "Lies!" screeched Widow Parson, who had once accused Agnes of stealing her best spoon. "I have seen her whispering to it at night, calling names that aren't mortal." This was technically true. Agnes sometimes spoke to her dead husband's memory in the glass, a habit born of loneliness rather than sorcery. But no one cared for such distinctions. Then came the real proof, the testimony of a boy named Tom, the miller's youngest, who swore he had seen Agnes' reflection move on its own, grinning at him with too many teeth. The boy's story grew with each telling, until the villagers were certain Agnes had sent her reflection out at night to poison their crops and sour their milk. The verdict was never in doubt. Agnes was given one last night in her cell, a dank little room beneath the magistrate's house, where the walls wept with damp and the rats scurried in the corners. The mirror was brought to her, a cruel jest, so she might confess her sins to it before her hanging. She took it in her bound hands, staring into its depths. And then she laughed. The guard outside, a superstitious man named Combe, stiffened at the sound. He pressed his ear to the door, listening as Agnes murmured something too low to hear. Then silence. Too long a silence. When Combe finally worked up the nerve to open the door, the cell was empty. No Agnes. No broken locks. No sign of escape. Only the mirror, lying face up on the straw, its surface cracked down the middle like a grin. Combe, against his better judgment, peered into it, and for the briefest moment he saw not his own reflection, but Agnes. Her eyes bright, her mouth moving as though in speech, before the glass fogged over, as if breathed upon from the other side. He dropped it. The next morning, the village awoke to find every mirror in Blackthorn shattered. In the magistrate's house, in the tavern, even the tiny scrap of polished tin the blacksmith's wife used to pin her hair, all of them broken, as though struck by an unseen hand. Agnes was never found. But sometimes, on nights when the wind howled just so, the villagers claimed they could hear a woman's laughter drifting from the empty cell beneath the magistrate's house. And if they dared to look into any remaining shard of glass, they swore they saw not their own faces, but hers, watching, waiting, her smile sharp as broken mirror edges. As for the boy Tom, the one who had sealed her fate with his tale of moving reflections, he disappeared the following winter. The only trace left behind was his footprints in the snow, leading up to the cracked remains of his mother's vanity mirror, and then vanishing, as though he had simply stepped inside. Chapter 3. Vanity in the Devil's Work. In the autumn of 1611, beneath the vaulted ceilings of St. Jerome's Church in the bustling market town of Harrogate, a young woman named Beatrice Fairchild committed an unforgivable sin. She looked at herself in a mirror. Not just looked, lingered. She studied the curve of her cheek, the dark sweep of her lashes, the way her lips parted ever so slightly when lost in thought. It was a stolen moment, hidden away in her chamber, but it was enough. Because in Harrogate, as in much of the world at the time, vanity was not merely a weakness. It was the devil's invitation. Beatrice knew this, of course. The sermons had made it clear. Father Alden's voice, thick with condemnation, had echoed from the pulpit just that Sunday. Mirror is Satan's ledger, where pride is tallied and souls are bought. The congregation had nodded along, women tucking stray hairs beneath their caps, men avoiding even the polished buckles on their shoes, lest they catch a glimpse of their own faces, and fall But Beatrice had always been curious. Her mirror was a small oval thing, its frame worn smooth by time. It had belonged to her grandmother, a woman whispered to have been too fond of finery before an unfortunate incident involving a toppled candle and a silk dress. Beatrice had found it wrapped in linen at the bottom of an old chest, and though she knew she should have broken it or given it to the church, she had instead tucked it beneath her mattress like a secret. That was her first mistake. The second was looking into it for too long, because the longer she stared, the stranger her reflection became. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of movement where there should have been stillness, a shadow crossing her face even as the candlelight remained steady. Then, one evening, her reflection winked at her. Beatrice dropped the mirror. It landed face up on the floor, unbroken, and when she dared to glance again, her reflection was as it should be, pale, wide-eyed, and unmistakably her own. She told herself she had imagined it. She was tired. The light had been unsteady. She had been breathing too fast. But the next night, when she looked again, her reflection smiled before she did. Beatrice should have smashed the glass then. She should have thrown it into the river, or taken it to Father Alden for blessing. Instead, she found herself drawn back to it night after night, fascinated by the way her reflection seemed just slightly more than she was, more vibrant, more knowing, more alive. It was only a matter of time before someone noticed. Mistress Caldwell, the sharp-eyed midwife who lived next door, was the first to comment. "You've grown vain," she remarked one morning as Beatrice adjusted her cap in the market square. "I've seen you touching your hair too often. That's how it starts." Beatrice flushed and mumbled an excuse, but the damage was done. Rumors spread quickly in Harrogate. By week's end, the baker's wife was whispering that Beatrice had been seen gazing into a devil's glass, and the tailor's apprentice swore had passed her window at midnight and seen not one but two figures standing by the candlelight. When Father Alden came to her door, his expression grim, Beatrice knew what was coming. "They say you've been consorting with your own image," he said, his voice low. "That you've been seduced by pride." Beatrice considered denying it. She considered lying. But something in her, some stubborn, reckless thing, made her lift her chin instead. "What if I have?" she asked. "Is it so wicked to want to know my own face?" Father Alden's nostrils flared. "Vanity is the first step toward damnation," he intoned. "The devil begins with a glance, then claims the soul by degrees." He demanded the mirror. Beatrice, against all sense, refused. That night, a mob gathered outside her house. They carried torches, not because it was dark, the moon was full, but because fire purified, and they were convinced something in Beatrice needed burning out. They shouted scripture. They called her witch. They demanded she surrender the mirror or face judgment. Beatrice, standing at her window, did something then that none of them expected. She laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a hysterical one, but a deep, rolling sound that seemed to echo far beyond the walls of her little house. And as she laughed, she raised the mirror, not to smash it, not to surrender it, but to let the mob see their own faces reflected back at them, twisted in fury and fear. "Look at yourselves," she said, her voice carrying. "Tell me, which of us is vain?" For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the first stone flew. It shattered her window. The second struck her shoulder. The third would have hit her brow, but she ducked, clutching the mirror to her chest as she fled deeper into the house. The mob surged forward, a single animal of many limbs, their torches casting monstrous shadows on the walls. Beatrice did the only thing left to her. She looked into the mirror one last time. Her reflection grinned back. Then it reached out, through the glass, and pulled her in. When the mob broke down her door, they found the house empty. No Beatrice. No mirror. Only the faint scent of roses, though it was long past the season for them, and on the floor where she had stood, a single shard of glass reflecting not the room, not the torchlight, but a distant, impossible hallway lined with endless mirrors, and a figure walking away. Her laughter! The next Sunday, Father Alden preached a sermon on the dangers of vanity. He spoke of Beatrice as a cautionary tale. He warned his flock to guard their hearts against pride. And if afterward certain members of the congregation avoided their own reflections a little too carefully, if they flinched at the sight of polished metal or still water, no one remarked on it. After all, it was only sensible. Wasn't it? Chapter 4. The Cursed Looking-Glass. In the winter of 1620, a merchant named Alistair Kemp made the mistake of buying a mirror at auction. This was not in itself unusual. Alistair was a man of means, with a house in London and a fondness for collecting oddities. Antique maps, peculiar coins, the occasional stuffed bird of uncertain origin. But this mirror was different. It was large, nearly the height of a man, its frame blackened oak, carved with strange twisting figures that seemed to shift if stared at too long. The auctioneer, a nervous little man with a habit of wiping his palms on his coat, had been oddly insistent that it came as is, with no guarantees of quality, or more importantly, safety. Alistair, being both wealthy and stubborn, took this as a challenge. The first sign of trouble came when the mirror was delivered to his home. The workmen tasked with carrying it swore it grew heavier with each step, until by the time they reached Alistair's study their arms trembled and their breath came in short gasps. One of them, a burly fellow named Graves, later claimed the mirror had whispered to him, a sound like dry leaves scraping against stone. But no one believed him. Graves quit the next day and was found a week later, drowned in the Thames, his pockets full of shards of broken glass. Alistair dismissed this as coincidence. His wife, Margaret, was less certain. She hated the mirror from the moment she saw it. "It doesn't reflect right," she told him the first night it stood in their home. "The light bends around it. Look, it makes the room seem darker than it is." Alistair scoffed. "It's a mirror, Margaret. It shows what's there." But Margaret wasn't so sure. Because when she passed it, she sometimes caught movement in the corner of her eye. Not her own reflection, but something standing just behind her, its face pressed too close to the glass. And once, very late at night, she swore she heard a woman humming from inside it. The children saw things too. Their youngest, a girl of 6 named Lottie, began having nightmares about the lady in the mirror, who smiled with too many teeth and promised to teach her how to stay young forever. Their son, Thomas, refused to enter the study at all, claiming the mirror made him feel like he was being watched from the inside. Even the household dog, a usually fearless mastiff named Brutus, would not go near it, growling low in his throat whenever he passed the door. Still, Alistair refused to get rid of it. Then the accident started. A maid polishing the mirror's frame slipped and cut her hand on the glass. The wound festered within hours, and by morning Her arm was black to the elbow. The physician, a grim man named Dr. Vexley, took one look at the rotting flesh and declared it beyond saving. The maid died screaming as they sawed off her arm. Her last words, a garbled warning about hands in the mirror. A week later, the cook, a stout, sensible woman who had worked for the Kemps for a decade, walked into the study to ask Alistair of the evening's menu, and emerged minutes later, her hair turned white, her lips moving soundlessly. She never spoke again, though she would sometimes scribble nonsense on scraps of paper. Always the same phrase over and over. She wants a face, she wants a face, she wants a face. Margaret begged Alistair to destroy the mirror. He refused. It's valuable, he insisted, though by then he had begun to look pale himself, his eyes shadowed, his hands trembling when he thought no one was watching. He spent more and more time in the study, staring into the mirror's depths, muttering to himself. Once, Margaret crept to the door and heard him arguing with someone, except there was no one else in the room. The final straw came on Christmas Eve. The Kemps had guests, Margaret's sister and her husband, along with their 2 children. The adults were drinking spiced wine in the parlor when young Eliza, Margaret's niece, wandered off. They found her in the study, standing before the mirror, her small hands pressed against the glass. She was smiling. "Eliza?" Margaret called softly. The girl didn't turn. Margaret stepped closer, her stomach knotting. "Eliza, darling, come away from there." Then she saw it. In the mirror, Eliza's reflection was not alone. A woman stood behind her, her arms wrapped around the child's waist, her chin resting on Eliza's shoulder. She was beautiful in the way a knife is beautiful, sharp and cold and dangerous. Her lips were moving, whispering something into Eliza's ear. Margaret screamed. By the time the others arrived, the mirror was empty. No woman. No Eliza. Just their own horrified faces staring back at them. Alistair, at last, seemed to understand. He seized the fireplace poker and swung it at the mirror with all his strength. The glass shattered, but instead of falling, the shards covered in the air for a heartbeat before flying outward, embedding themselves in the walls, the furniture, Alistair's face. He fell, bleeding from a dozen cuts, as the last sliver of glass drifted gently to the floor. The study was silent. Then, from somewhere very far away, a little girl laughed. The Kemps moved out the next day. The house stood empty for years, though neighbors claimed they sometimes saw faces in the windows, faces that didn't match the family who had lived there. Faces that watched. Faces that waited. As for the mirror itself, no one knows. But if you ever find yourself at an auction and see a large oak-framed looking glass being sold as is, do yourself a favor. Keep walking. Chapter 5. The Alchemist's Obsession. In the autumn of 1632, beneath the crooked eaves of a crumbling house in Prague, an alchemist named Valdemar Vesperin committed the greatest mistake of his career. He believed he could control what lived inside a mirror. Vesperin was not a foolish man, at least not by the standards of his profession. He had spent 30 years studying the arcane, deciphering ancient texts, and conducting experiments that would make a lesser man's hair turn white overnight. He had turned lead into something approximating gold, if one squinted, distilled elixirs that prolonged life, if one ignored the liver damage, and once memorably summoned a minor demon that had mostly just complained about the draft before dissipating. But mirrors were different. The one that obsessed him was no ordinary looking glass. It was a circular disc of Venetian glass, its surface so flawless it seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. The frame was silver, engraved with alchemical symbols that even Vesperin did not fully understand, though he had spent 3 sleepless weeks trying. He had acquired it from a blind merchant in Naples who claimed it had once belonged to John Dee himself, that infamous conjurer of angels. The merchant had been disturbingly eager to be rid of it. Vesperin should have taken that as a warning. Instead, he saw only possibility. The earliest experiments were promising. When exposed to certain lunar-infused tinctures, the mirror's surface rippled like water. When aligned with specific constellations, it produced faint whispers in a language that prickled the skin. And once, during a particularly potent conjunction of Mars and Saturn, Vesperin swore he saw a figure standing just beyond the glass, a tall, slender shape with eyes that burned like banked coals. That was when he should have stopped. But alchemists, as a rule, do not know when to stop. So Vesperin doubled his efforts. He arranged 7 more mirrors around the original, each angled to catch and amplify its properties. He anointed the glass with tinctures of mercury and crushed pearl. He recited incantations in languages dead for 1,000 years. And then, one night, the mirror answered. It began with a sound, a slow, wet clicking, like bones settling. Then the surface fogged over, though the room was warm. Vesperin leaned closer, his breath quickening. And the reflection that looked back was not his own. It was a face, but only just barely. The features swam as if seen through troubled water. A mouth too wide, eyes too deep, a smile that showed too many teeth. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of glass scraping against stone. "You have been looking for May," it said. Vesperin, to his credit, did not scream. He did, however, spill a very expensive vial of quintessence onto his best doublet. "Who? What are you?" The reflection's smile widened. "Ah, friend, a teacher. The answer to your questions." Vesperin hesitated. This was, he knew, the moment alchemists dreamed of, contact with something beyond mortal understanding. But there were rules, precautions. "Untimsidi." "Prove it," he said. "Tell me something only an adept would know." The thing in the mirror laughed, a sound like breaking icicles. "You keep your mother's ring in a box beneath your bed. You burned your first grimoire when you were 12, afraid your father would find it. You still dream of drowning in liquid gold." Vesperin bent very still. No one knew those things. No one Hemcutting know them. The reflection leaned closer until its nose nearly touched the glass. "Shall I tell you how to make the philosopher's stone?" That was the moment Vesperin lost his caution. The thing in the mirror taught him many things in the weeks that followed. How to distill moonlight into a tangible mist. How to write words in fire that lingered in the air. How to brew a draught that let him walk in dreams. Each lesson came at a price. A lock of hair, a drop of blood, a memory from his childhood. Small things, really. Nothing he couldn't spare. Then came the night the mirror asked for his shadow. Vesperin barked. "That's not possible." "Everything is possible," the reflection whispered. "But if you fear, we can stop." They did not stop. The process was painless, as these things often are. Vesperin stood between 2 candles at midnight, reciting the words the mirror had taught him. When he finished, he felt a strange lightness, a detachment, as if some essential part of him had been gently removed. He turned to look at the wall. Where his shadow should have been, there was nothing. The mirror, for its part, seemed satisfied. That was the only word for it. The reflection smiled more often now, its features becoming clearer, more defined. It no longer waited for Vesperin to approach. Sometimes, when he entered the workshop, it was already watching him. And then, one morning, Vesperin woke to find the mirror empty. Not just empty, wrong bit. The glass had gone matte like old milk, and no matter how he tilted it, no reflection appeared. Not his. Not the thing's. Nothing. Vesperin spent the day in a panic, checking every angle, every incantation. Had he offended it? Had the bond broken? Was this some test? That night, he dreamed of drowning. Not in gold, as he sometimes had before, but in something thick and dark and cold. He woke gasping, his lungs burning, his sheets soaked with, not sweat, undilatorta, babadis, nim deri, wa, salt water. He sat up, trembling, and saw the mirror across the room. It was no longer matte. Now it showed a vast, dark expanse, an ocean under a starless sky. And floating just beneath its surface, limbs drifting lazily in the current, was a body. His body. Vesperin scrambled back, his heart pounding. But when he looked again, the mirror showed only his own terrified face. The next day his left hand began to prune. Not from water. Not from age. The skin simply wrinkled, as if he had been swimming for hours. By evening, the nails had turned blue. The mirror, when he confronted it, showed only the dark ocean again. "You gave me your shadow," the reflection said. "Did you think that was the end?" Vesperin's breath came fast. "What do you want?" The reflection smiled. "Everything. But we can start with your name." Vesperin refused. The thing in the mirror did not argue. It simply watched as the pruning spread up his arm. By week's end, Vesperin could taste salt when he breathed. His skin grew clammy, his hair stiff with it. He stopped sleeping, afraid of the dreams. And then, one morning, he woke to the sound of waves. Not in his head, not in the mirror. In his rooms, water lapped at the edges of his bed, dark and endless. The mirror floated just beyond reach, its surface now a doorway, an invitation. Vesperin screamed. But when his housekeeper arrived, she found only an empty bed, damp sheets, and a shattered mirror. Of Vesperin himself, there was no sign, though if you press your ear to a seashell, you might hear something. Not the ocean, no guy. Something singing. And if you listen very, very closely, you might recognize the voice. Chapter 6. The Haunted Hall of Mirrors. In the year 1645, Lord Percival Ashworth hosted a grand ball at his ancestral estate, Blackthorn Manor, to celebrate his daughter's engagement. The manor was famed for many things: its sprawling gardens, its vaulted ceilings, its wine cellars stocked with vintages older than the monarchy itself. But its most infamous feature was the Hall of Mirrors. The hall was not original to the manor. It had been installed by Lord Percival's great-grandfather, a man with a taste for the extravagant and a disregard for superstition. The mirrors were floor to ceiling, lining both sides of a long, narrow gallery, each framed in gilded silver and polished to such a shine that walking through the hall felt like stepping into infinity. Guests at the ball remarked on how unsettling it was. Not because of the reflections themselves, no, those were ordinary enough at first glance, but because the reflections did not always match. Lady Eleanor Montague was the first to notice. As she glided through the hall on the arm of her husband, she caught sight of her reflection in one of the mirrors and froze. "Charles," she whispered, gripping his sleeve. "That isn't me." Her husband chuckled. "Nonsense, my dear. You've had too much wine." But Lady Eleanor was certain. The woman in the mirror wore her face, her gown, her jewels, but she was smiling, and Lady Eleanor was not. Other guests began to report similar oddities. Lord Fitzwilliam swore his reflection, winked at him. Miss Arabella Hartley screamed when hers reached out as if to touch her. And young Jonathan Ashworth, Lord Percival's nephew, became hysterical when his reflection, a boy of 12 like himself, suddenly aged into a withered old man before his eyes. Lord Percival, ever the gracious host, dismissed it all as tricks of the light, the result of too much revelry and the flickering candlelight. But his wife, Lady Beatrice, knew better. She had always hated the Hall of Mirrors. As a girl, she had been told the story of its construction, how workmen had gone mad during its installation, babbling about whispers in the glass. How 3 maids had thrown themselves from the manor's highest window, their final words a warning that something in the mirrors was hungry. But the Ashworths did not speak of such things. The night of the ball, long after the last guest had departed, and the servants had extinguished the candles, Lady Beatrice awoke to the sound of footsteps. Not in the hallway, in the hall of mirrors. She followed the sound, her nightgown whispering against the floor, her candle casting long, trembling shadows. When she reached the entrance to the hall, she hesitated. The mirrors should have been dark, their surfaces black with night. But they weren't. Each one glowed faintly, as if lit from within, and in their depths figures moved. Not reflections. People. Dozens of them, dressed in fashions from decades past, their faces frozen in silent scream. Some clawed at the glass. Some wept. Some simply stared, their eyes hollow. And at the far end of the hall, standing before the largest mirror, was a woman. She was tall and pale, her gown the color of old bone, her hair coiled in an elaborate style that had not been in fashion for a century. When she turned to face Lady Beatrice, her smile was slow, deliberate. "You see us," the woman said, though her lips did not move. Lady Beatrice's breath caught. "Who are you?" The woman's reflection stepped closer. "The ones who came before. The ones who lingered too long. The ones who were taken." Lady Beatrice wanted to run, but her feet would not obey. "What do you want?" The woman's smile widened. "Company, je geste fudodisi, underkais company mine." Then the reflection surged forward. Not just the woman, all of them. Hands pressed against the glass, fingers curling as if searching for purchase. The mirrors trembled. The air hummed. And then, one by one, the reflections stepped out. Lady Beatrice screamed. The servants found her at dawn, curled on the floor of the hall, her hair turned white, her fingers bloody from scratching at the walls. She babbled nonsense, her words tangled and frantic. "Care inside now. They're wearing our faces. They're waiting." Lord Percival, ever practical, declared his wife ill and confined her to her chambers. The Hall of Mirrors was closed, its doors locked, its key thrown into the deepest part of the manor's lake. But sometimes on quiet nights, the servants swear they hear laughter from behind those doors. And if you press your ear to the wood, you might hear something else too. The sound of glass cracking. Slowly, deliberately, as if something is trying to get out. Chapter 7. The Mirror and the Plague. London, 1665. The year the city learned to fear its own reflection. The plague had come quietly at first. A dead rat in an alleyway, a beggar coughing blood into his sleeve, a faint smell of rot on the summer breeze. Then the deaths began in earnest. Houses were marked with red crosses. Bodies piled high in the streets. The air grew thick with the stench of burning herbs and burning flesh, and people whispered that the end of days had come. And then the rumors started. It began with a physician named Dr. Nathaniel Whitby, who noticed something peculiar about his dying patients. Those who owned mirrors succumbed faster. Their fevers burned hotter. Their skin blackened sooner. Their final hours were marked by delirious ramblings about faces in the glass, faces that were not their own. Whitby, a man of science, but also a man of his time, made the connection at once. The plague was spreading through mirrors. He presented his findings to the city's remaining officials. At first, they scoffed. But as the death toll rose, as entire households perished overnight, as terrified citizens reported seeing ghostly figures in their looking glasses moments before falling ill, the authorities took action. An edict was issued. All mirrors were to be destroyed. The great mirror smashing of London began on a Tuesday. Men with hammers and axes went door to door, shattering every looking-glass they could find. Paul mirrors, hand mirrors, even the tiny reflective buttons on ladies' dresses. Nothing was spared. The streets ran with quicksilver, the poisonous mercury that gave mirrors their shine, and children played in the glittering puddles until their fingers grew numb and their lips turned blue. Thomas Farthing, a glassmaker by trade, watched as his life's work was reduced to shards. His shop had been famous for its mirrors, each one painstakingly crafted, each one a masterpiece of reflection. Now the bailiffs were tearing them from the walls, smashing them in the street, while Farthing stood by with empty hands. "You don't understand," he pleaded, as they took his finest piece, a mirror framed in ebony, its surface so clear it seemed like a window to another world. "This one's special. The bailiff didn't let him finish. The hammer came down, and something screamed. Not the glass, not Farthing, something else, something that had been inside the mirror. The sound was high and thin, like metal scraping bone, and it sent every bird within a mile scattering into the smoke-choked sky. The bailiff stumbled back, his face pale. The other men froze. Then from the shattered remains, a dark liquid began to seep. Not mercury. Something thicker. Something that moved against the cobblestones like it was alive. The bailiff reached for it with the tip of his boot. The moment he touched it, he collapsed. By nightfall he was dead, his body covered in black boils, his eyes wide and staring, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. The plague doctors who examined him found something curious. His pupils, when they pried his eyelids open, were not round but jagged, as if they'd been cracked like glass. The mirror smashing continued, but now the men worked in fear, sprinkling holy water on every shard, crossing themselves when the glass made odd sounds under their hammers. Some mirrors shattered easily. Others resisted, their surfaces bending but not breaking until they were ground to dust beneath wagon wheels. A few, a very few, were buried whole in churchyards, their surfaces facing downward, as if to trap whatever lived inside them. Martha Cooper, a scullery maid in a now empty noble house, was tasked with destroying her mistress's prized vanity mirror. She approached it with a poker, her hands shaking. The mirror was ancient, its silver backing flaking away to reveal patches of darkness beneath. As Martha raised the poker, she caught sight of her reflection, but it wasn't her. The reflection was smiling. Martha brought the poker down. The glass shattered, and the reflection stepped out. It looked like her, moved like her, but its skin was too smooth, its eyes too bright. It reached for Martha with fingers that gleamed like polished glass. She tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat as the thing that was not Martha pressed its cold hands against her face. When the mirror breakers found her hours later, Martha was sitting before the shattered glass, humming softly. She turned to them with a smile too wide for her face and said, "It's all right. I understand now." They buried her the next day, after she coughed up a handful of glass shards and died. By winter, the plague began to recede. Whether it was the lack of mirrors or simply the disease running its course, no one could say. The people of London picked through the wreckage of their lives trying to rebuild. But sometimes, in the quiet of night, those who had owned mirrors would startle awake, certain they'd heard the sound of breaking glass. And in the mornings they'd find strange marks on their windows, handprints, but not their own, as if something had been trying to get in. Or perhaps trying to get out. As for the few mirrors that survived, hidden in attics, buried in gardens, forgotten in abandoned houses, they wait. Their surfaces grow cloudy with age. Their frames gather dust. But they remember. And in the right light, if you look very closely, you might see something move. Just a trick of the eye, of course. Nothing more. Chapter 8. The Courtier's Downfall. In the spring of 1672, at the court of King Charles II, there lived a man so enamored with his own reflection that he commissioned a full-length mirror to accompany him wherever he went. His name was Sir Reginald Fitzwilliam III, And his vanity was legendary even in an age where powdered wigs reached ridiculous heights and beauty patches were applied with geometric precision. Sir Reginald's mirror was no ordinary looking-glass. It was a towering monstrosity of beveled Venetian glass, set in a gilded frame so heavy it required 2 footmen to carry it. He had it positioned opposite him at meals, so he might admire himself while eating. He angled it near windows to catch his profile in the most flattering light. During evening entertainments he would have it placed strategically behind him so ladies might admire the back of his head while he held court. This, as you might imagine, made him insufferable company. The other courtiers tolerated his obsession because Sir Reginald was wealthy, well-connected, and just amusing enough to remain in the king's favor. But behind his back, they mocked him relentlessly. The Duke of Pembroke once quipped that Sir Reginald's mirror must be defective, as no glass could possibly capture his magnificence accurately. Lady Montague suggested he marry the thing and be done with it. Even the king himself, when particularly bored, would ask Sir Reginald to consult his better half before making decisions. None of this deterred the man. If anything, his fixation grew worse. He began refusing to leave his chambers unless the mirror assured him he looked acceptable. He would spend hours practicing expressions in its surface, the perfect smirk for receiving compliments, the exact angle of a melancholy gaze when listening to music, the precise lift of an eyebrow when feigning disinterest. Then came the morning when the mirror spoke back. Sir Reginald had been admiring his freshly powdered wig when his reflection suddenly said, "You missed a spot." He jumped nearly out of his silk stockings. His reflection, smirked at him. Not the practiced smirk he'd spent weeks perfecting, but something far more natural, more knowing. "Did you just speak?" obviously said the reflection. It adjusted its cravat in a manner Sir Reginald never would have dared. Too loose, too rakish. "You've been staring at me for years. It was only a matter of time before I started staring back." Sir Reginald should have been terrified. He should have called for a priest. Instead, he was delighted. Finally, someone who truly understood him. The reflection proved to be excellent company. It complemented his fashion choices, though it occasionally suggested bolder colors. It offered scathing commentary about other courtiers, always accurate. It even helped him refine his dancing by demonstrating steps from angles he couldn't normally see. Within weeks, Sir Reginald was consulting the mirror on everything from politics to poetry. This was when things began to go wrong. At the king's midsummer ball, Sir Reginald's reflection suggested he wear an emerald green coat that clashed horribly with the royal decor. When the king frowned upon it, the reflection whispered, "He's just jealous." Sir Reginald repeated this aloud. The resulting silence could have preserved meat. A week later, the reflection convinced him to challenge the Earl of Suffolk to a duel over an imagined slight. Only the Earl's drunken inability to stand straight prevented bloodshed. Then came the final straw. During a critical vote in Parliament, the reflection mouthed the words, "They're all laughing at you," just as Sir Reginald rose to speak. What followed was a tirade so spectacularly offensive that even the king's famous patience evaporated. Sir Reginald was banished from court, his titles stripped, his fortune seized. As servants packed his belongings, the mirror was the last thing to be created. Sir Reginald stood before it, haggard and unpowdered, his magnificent wig abandoned somewhere in his disgrace. "This is your fault," he muttered. The reflection shrugged. "I'm just a mirror. I only show what's already there." Then it winked out. Not faded. Not vanished. Winked like a candle snuffed by fingers. Where Sir Reginald's reflection should have been, there was only empty glass. He screamed then, a sound that brought servants running. They found him clawing at the mirror's surface, begging his reflection to return, to tell him what to do, to show him himself again. The mirror, of course, showed nothing at all. Sir Reginald spent his final years in a small country house, surrounded by cheap looking-glasses he'd purchased from traveling merchants. None of them ever spoke to him again, though sometimes, when the light was just right, he thought he saw something move in their depths. Something that looked like him, only younger, handsomer, forever frozen at the height of his glory. As for the original mirror, it found its way back to court, where it currently hangs in a little-used corridor of Hampton Court Palace. Visitors sometimes remark on how it seems to follow them with unseen eyes. And if you stand very still before it, you might just hear a faint, familiar sigh. The sound of a man forever admiring himself in eternity. Chapter 9. The Broken Mirror Prophecy. In the winter of 1687, in a small village near the Black Forest, a young woman named Greta Schultz dropped a mirror. This was not particularly noteworthy in itself. People drop things all the time. But this mirror was special. It had been in Greta's family for generations, passed down from mother to daughter with strict instructions never to let it shatter. Its glass was said to have been blessed by a wandering monk in the time of the Crusades, its frame carved from wood taken from a hanged witch's gallows. The mirror knew things. It remembered things. And above all, it did not forgive carelessness. When the mirror hit the floor of Greta's cottage, it did not simply break. It exploded. Shards flew in every direction, embedding themselves in the walls, the ceiling, even Greta's apron. The largest fragment landed upright against the leg of her spinning wheel, and when Greta bent to collect it, her bloodied fingers trembling, she saw that her reflection was wrong. Not missing, not distorted. Wrong, de politie. Wrong is to leave well, I see. Her reflection was smiling. And then it spoke. 7 years, it said, its voice like the crackling of ice underfoot. Greta stumbled backward, knocking over a stool. What? 7 years of misfortune, the reflection clarified, examining its nails with idle interest. That's the traditional punishment, isn't it? Or did you think all those stories were just for children? Greta had in fact thought exactly that. The peasants in her village muttered about bad luck when mirrors broke, but they muttered about bad luck when cats crossed their paths or when someone sneezed during a harvest prayer. It was nonsense. Superstition. Until now. The reflection watched her with something like amusement. Shall we begin? The next morning, Greta's cow died. Not of illness, not of age. It simply dropped dead in its stall, its eyes wide and glassy, its tongue black as if it had been poisoned. When the butcher came to examine it, he found shards of mirror embedded in its throat, though Greta swore none had been missing from her cottage. 2 days later, the village well ran dry. Not frozen, not low. Dry as if it had never held water at all. The villagers dug deeper, but all they found were more mirror shards, their surfaces reflecting not the dirt around them, but a night sky no one recognized. By week's end, Greta's fiancé broke their engagement. He gave no reason, only that he dreamed of her reflection strangling him in his sleep, and when he woke, his pillow had been full of broken glass. Greta went to the village priest. Father Reinhardt listened to her story with the patience of a man who had heard many strange confessions. When she finished, he sighed and opened an ancient tome bound in what looked like human skin. The 7-year curse, he murmured. I thought it only a legend. Greta's hands clenched in her lap. Can it be broken? The priest hesitated. There are stories, rituals, but none pleasant. The ritual, when he explained it, was simple in theory. Greta had to collect every shard of the broken mirror, every single one, and melt them down in a fire blessed by 3 different priests. Then she had to drink the molten glass. Greta stared at him. That's suicide. Father Reinhardt nodded. Yes, but the alternative is 7 years of suffering, after which the mirror will reform itself, with your soul inside it. Greta left the church in a daze. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard a sound from the hearth, a scraping like glass against stone. When she rose to investigate, she found the largest shard of the mirror propped against the firewood, its surface gleaming in the moonlight. Her reflection smiled at her. He lied, you know. Greta's breath caught. About what? The ritual. The reflection leaned closer, its nose nearly touching the glass. It won't free you. It'll just make the suffering permanent. Greta swallowed. How do I know you're telling the truth? The reflection laughed. You don't, but ask yourself this. Why would a priest know how to break a curse older than Christianity? The next morning, Greta packed what few belongings she had left and left the village. She wandered for years, from town to town, always one step ahead of the misfortune that followed her. Crops failed where she worked. Wells dried up where she drank. Lovers died in bizarre accidents. One choked on a sliver of glass that appeared in his wine. Another walked into a river while sleepwalking, his pockets full of mirrored shards. After exactly 7 years, Greta returned to her village. The cottage was just as she'd left it, though the door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, the hearth was cold, the floor thick with dust. And in the center of the room, whole and unbroken, stood the mirror. Greta approached it slowly. Her reflection smiled. Welcome home. Then it reached out and pulled her in. The villagers found the cottage empty a week later when they came to investigate the strange light they'd seen glowing in its windows. The only thing out of place was the mirror, now hanging slightly askew on the wall. And if you press your ear to its surface on quiet nights, you can still hear Greta screaming. As for the curse itself, well, that lived on. Because the truth was, the mirror had never been satisfied with just one soul. It wanted more. It wanted to be feared. And so it let the story spread. The story of 7 years' bad luck, of curses and consequences. Because the more people believed it, the more power the mirror had. And mirrors, after all, are very good at reflecting what we already fear. Chapter 10. The Mirror Exorcism. On the eve of All Saints' Day in 1691, Father Ignatius Voss received an urgent summons to the estate of Baron von Auerbach. The message, delivered by a trembling stable boy with fingernails chewed to the quick, spoke of a possessed mirror that had driven 3 maids to madness and caused the Baron's youngest son to speak in tongues. Father Voss was no stranger to such requests. In his 60 years as a priest, he had performed exorcisms on everything from haunted chamber pots to a particularly troublesome pear tree said to whisper blasphemies after midnight. But mirrors were different. Mirrors remembered. The Baron's estate was in chaos when he arrived. Servants clustered in frightened knots in the hallways. A black velvet drape had been hung over the offending mirror. A massive Venetian glass that dominated the grand staircase landing. From beneath the drape came a faint, rhythmic tapping, as if someone on the other side was counting down the seconds until the priest's arrival. The Baron, a man whose impressive mustache could not quite conceal his twitching lips, grasped Voss's hands. It started with the maids seeing figures behind them in the glass. Then my son Klaus claimed his reflection winked at him. Last Tuesday, the mirror began singing. Voss raised an eyebrow. Singing? A Gregorian chant, the Baron confirmed. Backwards kind. That evening, Voss prepared for the exorcism with methodical precision. He lit 13 blessed candles around the draped mirror. He prepared a flask of holy water mixed with powdered silver and 3 drops of his own blood, an old trick he'd learned from a Jesuit who'd survived an encounter with a possessed reliquary in Prague. He even wore his stole inside out, just in case the entity had learned to recognize standard exorcism protocols. When midnight struck, he drew back the drape. The mirror was worse than he'd imagined. Its surface rippled like disturbed water, though the air was perfectly still. Dark shapes moved beneath the glass, coiling and uncoiling like smoke. And in the center, staring back at him with his own face, was something that was most decidedly not Father Voss. It had his wrinkles, his stooped shoulders, even the strawberry birthmark on his left cheek. But its eyes were black pits, and its smile showed at least 12 more teeth than any human mouth should contain. "Ah," said the reflection, its voice a perfect mimicry of Voss's own. "The cavalry has arrived." Voss did not flinch. He'd seen this trick before. "In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti." The reflection yawned. Yes, very impressive. Tell me, does that actually work on anything more sophisticated than a mildly annoyed poltergeist? Voss continued the rite, sprinkling holy water on the glass. Where the droplets struck, the surface hissed and bubbled, leaving behind tiny star-shaped burns. The reflection winced but did not disappear. "Clever," it admitted, "but you're missing the point." It leaned closer until its nose nearly touched the glass. "This isn't about possession. It's about invitation." Voss paused. "What do you mean?" The reflection gestured to the grand hall around them. The portraits of stern ancestors, the suits of armor standing sentry, the Baron himself peeking nervously from behind a marble column. "They hung me here. They dust me. They admire themselves in me. For generations they've treated me as both prized possession and lurking threat." The reflection's smile widened. "Can you blame me for finally deciding to play the role they've assigned me?" The candles flickered. One guttered out entirely. Voss understood now. This was no simple possession. The mirror wasn't haunted. It had been given power by centuries of fear and fascination. Every time a maid gasped at seeing movement in its depths. Every time a child dared another to touch its surface at midnight. Every time the Baron's ancestors had whispered stories of its curse, they'd fed it. And now it was hungry. The exorcism took 7 hours. Voss employed every trick he knew. Latin incantations, Hebrew psalms, even an old Nordic binding chant he'd learned from a Lutheran minister with suspiciously pagan tendencies. He drew sigils on the glass with consecrated oil. He pressed relics against its surface until the silver frame grew hot to the touch. Slowly, painfully, the reflection began to change. The extra teeth vanished first. Then the black eyes lightened to normal human brown. By dawn, it looked almost like a proper mirror again, if one ignored the occasional ripple across its surface, like a pond disturbed by a thrown stone. The Baron, peering over Voss's shoulder, let out a shaky breath. "Is it over?" Voss mopped his brow with a handkerchief that had once been white. "For now. But mirrors have long memories." He turned to face the nobleman. "I suggest you move it somewhere less central. Couldn't we just destroy it?" The reflection, which had been pretending to be an ordinary mirror again, let out a faint but audible chuckle. Voss sighed. "Best not." The mirror remained in the von Auerbach estate for another century, eventually being moved to a dusty guest bedroom where few dared to enter. Visitors occasionally reported seeing figures moving in its depths when no one was present, and one particularly imaginative scullery maid swore it had taught her a recipe for gooseberry tart that made everyone who ate it speak in rhyming couplets for a week. As for Father Voss, he retired shortly after the exorcism, claiming he'd had enough of sentient furniture. His final journal entry, written the night before his death at the remarkable age of 93, contained only a single sentence: "Never trust anything that watches you back." And if the small mirror above his writing desk happened to ripple in agreement, well, some things are best left unremarked upon. Chapter 11. The Traveler's Mistake. In the autumn of 1693, a linen merchant named Heinrich Brandt made the fatal error of purchasing an antique mirror at a Constantinople bazaar. This was not, in itself, an unusual act for a man of Heinrich's profession. He traveled frequently between Europe and the Orient, often returning with exotic trinkets to impress his neighbors in Hamburg. A carved ivory comb for his wife, a brass astrolabe for his bookkeeper, an ornate dagger that would spend the rest of its days opening letters. These were the harmless treasures of a man who fancied himself worldly. But the mirror was different. The merchant who sold it to him had been unusually insistent that it be covered during the voyage home. The glass grows restless when it sees too much. The man had whispered through a beard that smelled of cinnamon and mildew. Heinrich, assuming this to be some Eastern sales tactic meant to inflate the mirror's mystique, had laughed and paid in silver coins that disappeared into the merchant's sleeves with suspicious speed. The trouble began during the sea voyage. Heinrich had ignored the warning and left the mirror uncovered in his cabin. On the third night, the ship's cook, a Dutchman not given to flights of fancy, burst into Heinrich's quarters screaming about a woman standing behind him in the glass. When Heinrich turned, he saw only his own puzzled reflection. The cook refused to enter the cabin again, forcing Heinrich to collect his meals from the galley like a common sailor. By the time they reached Marseille, 2 more crew members had resigned after similar encounters. The ship's cat, normally indifferent to human affairs, took one look at the mirror and leapt overboard, preferring the Mediterranean's uncertain mercy to whatever lurked in the glass. Heinrich should have taken the hint. Instead, he brought the mirror home. His wife Greta, a practical woman who distrusted anything that couldn't be eaten or worn, took one look at the ornate silver frame and declared it ostentatious. Their daughter Liesel, however, was enchanted. At 12 years old, she found the mirror's imperfections romantic. The way its surface seemed to ripple when touched, the strange flecks of color that appeared in its depths at certain angles, the faint scent of roses that clung to it despite months at sea. The first incident occurred during Liesel's birthday celebration. As the girl stood before the mirror, admiring her new dress, her reflection suddenly reached up and unpinned its hair, an action Liesel had not taken. When she screamed, the reflection smiled and pressed a finger to its lips before returning to perfect mimicry. Heinrich, summoned by his daughter's cries, examined the glass with mounting unease. "It's just a trick of the light," he declared, too loudly. "Probably the candles." His reflection mouthed the words "liar" behind his back. Over the following weeks, the mirror's mischief grew bolder. Servants reported seeing figures moving in its depths when the room was empty. The household dog would sit before it for hours, growling at something only he could see. And one terrible night, Heinrich awoke to find his wife standing before the mirror, her nightdress soaked with sweat, whispering to a reflection that was not her own. "He's coming," Greta murmured when Heinrich shook her. "The man in the glass says he's coming for us." Heinrich did what any reasonable man would do. He consulted a priest. Father Anselm, a weary veteran of Hamburg's supernatural complaints, took one look at the mirror and sighed. "Where do you people keep finding these things?" The exorcism was brief and ineffective. Holy water beaded on the glass like mercury. Latin prayers elicited only faint laughter from the mirror's depths. When the priest pressed his crucifix to the surface, the reflection caught fire. A neat trick, given that the actual crucifix remained unharmed. "The problem," Father Anselm explained afterward, "is that it's not possessed in the traditional sense. It's more of a doorway, and something has noticed you've left it open." Heinrich considered smashing the mirror then, but something stayed his hand. Perhaps it was the investment. He had, after all, paid good silver for it. Or perhaps it was the way the reflections had started showing him things he wanted to see. His warehouse full to bursting with fine silks, his rivals bankrupt, his daughter married to a minor noble. That was his final mistake. The stranger arrived on the first night of winter. Heinrich awoke to find a man standing in his bedchamber, tall and pale, his clothing cut in a style centuries out of fashion, his eyes dark as the spaces between stars. The scent of roses filled the room. "You've been admiring my home," the stranger said in perfect German, though his lips didn't quite match the words. "I thought I should return the courtesy." Heinrich tried to scream, but his voice had fled. The stranger smiled. "Don't worry. I only want what's mine." He gestured to the mirror, where Heinrich's reflection stood frozen in terror. "You've been using it quite a lot, haven't you? Peering through, leaning in?" His smile widened. "You should be more careful with thresholds." When Greta awoke at dawn, she found the bed empty and cold. The mirror stood in its usual place, but its surface had gone strangely matte, like frosted glass. Of Heinrich there was no sign, save for his slippers, placed neatly before the mirror as if he had stepped into it. The household searched for weeks. They dragged the river. They questioned travelers. They even consulted a particularly disreputable witch who claimed Heinrich could be found in the silver, whatever that meant. Liesel, in her grief, took to spending hours before the mirror, begging it to return her father. One evening, her mother found her pressed against the glass, her palms flat against the surface. "I can hear him," Lisa whispered. "He's right on the other side." Greta, at last, understood. She waited until her daughter was asleep, then took an axe to the mirror. The first blow sent cracked spider webbing across its surface. The second produced a sound like distant screaming. The third shattered it entirely. From the broken glass rose a plume of silver mist that smelled of roses and salt. When it cleared, the shards showed nothing but ordinary reflections, albeit reflections that sometimes, when glimpsed from the corner of one's eye, appeared to be weeping. As for Heinrich Brandt, he was never seen again, at least not in the traditional sense. But travelers who passed through Hamburg in later years sometimes reported encountering a merchant in old-fashioned clothes, his wares spread on a tattered blanket near the docks. He sold only mirrors, small, cheap things with cloudy glass. And if a customer looked too long into one, the merchant would smile sadly and say, "Careful, friend. You never know who might be looking back." Then he would pack up his wares and vanish into the fog, leaving behind only the faint scent of roses. Chapter 12. The King's Forbidden Mirror. In the year 1634, King Louis XIII of France signed an edict banning all Venetian looking-glasses from his kingdom. This was not, as some whispered, due to concerns about vanity or extravagance among the nobility. It was because the king had seen what lived inside them, and he had no intention of letting it out. The trouble began with the Duc de Montpensier, a man better known for his gambling debts than his piety. At a banquet celebrating the king's latest military victory, the Duke had drunkenly boasted of owning a mirror that could show the future. The other courtiers laughed, until he led them to his private chambers and unveiled an enormous Venetian glass, its frame crusted with pearls and its surface so unnaturally clear it seemed to swallow the candlelight. "Ask it anything," the Duke slurred, running a finger along the gilded edge. "But be specific. It enjoys wordplay." The Marquis de Vivonne, never one to refuse a challenge, stepped forward. "Show me my greatest triumph." The mirror's surface rippled like disturbed water. Then, with dreadful clarity, it displayed the Marquis lying in state, his waxen face arranged in peaceful repose, surrounded by weeping mourners. The Marquis stumbled back, knocking over a servant. The reflection did not. The Duke only laughed. "I did say, in triumph." King Louis, who had been watching in silence, was not amused. He ordered the mirror covered at once, and the Duke confined to his quarters. But that night, alone in his bedchamber, the king could not resist one final look. He unveiled the mirror himself. At first it showed only his reflection, a man in his early 30s, already careworn from a decade of rule. Then, slowly, the image changed. The Louis in the mirror aged before his eyes, his face growing gaunt, his hair thinning, his eyes sinking into shadowed hollows. Behind him the reflection of Versailles burned. The worst part was the figure standing just over his shoulder, a tall, skeletal thing wrapped in moth-eaten velvet, its long fingers resting on mirrored Louis's shoulders like a lover. When the real Louis turned, there was nothing there. When he looked back, the figure smiled. The next morning, the king ordered the mirror destroyed. This proved more difficult than anticipated. The first workman's hammer bounced off the glass, as if striking stone, sending him sprawling with a broken wrist. The second attempt, using a blacksmith's forge, resulted only in the mirror laughing, a sound like shattering crystal. By sundown, 3 servants had quit, and the palace chaplain refused to enter the room where the mirror stood, claiming it had whispered his childhood sins to him in his mother's voice. Louis, never a patient man, took matters into his own hands. He had the mirror dragged to the courtyard at midnight, where he doused it in holy oil and set it alight. The flames burned blue and odorless, consuming the ornate frame but leaving the glass untouched. As dawn broke, the king was left staring at his own exhausted face in a mirror, now bordered only by ash. Then the reflection spoke. "Thank you," it said. "I've always wanted to see Versailles." With that, the mirror shattered itself, exploding outward in a storm of glass that somehow harmed no one, though the gardener's boy would later swear a shard had passed clean through his hand without leaving a mark. 3 days later, the ban on Venetian mirrors was announced. The official proclamation cited concerns over foreign influence and moral corruption, but the nobles who had been at the banquet knew better. Overnight, a thriving black market emerged for mirror smuggling, with prices rising according to the danger of the glass. The most coveted, and costly, were those that occasionally showed something other than the viewer's reflection. As for the Duc de Montpensier, he was found dead in his chambers a week after the incident, his body arranged as if sleeping, his face frozen in a smile. On the floor beside his bed lay a single shard of glass, its surface reflecting not the room, but a long hallway lined with identical mirrors, and something moving just beyond sight. King Louis, when informed, ordered the Duke buried with the glass fragment in his hands. "Let him keep it," the king muttered. "God knows I won't." The ban remained in effect for 7 years, until Louis' death. His successor, a boy of 9 who would one day be known as the Sun King, had the prohibition lifted his first week on the throne. The child had always liked mirrors. Chapter 13. The Mirror Thieves. Paris, 1678. In the shadow of the king's lifted ban, a new underworld flourished. The demand for safe mirrors had created a peculiar economy. Wealthy nobles wanted looking glasses that wouldn't whisper their secrets or show them their deaths, while the middle class simply hoped to own mirrors that didn't occasionally blink. The poor, who couldn't afford such luxuries, made do with polished metal or still water, though even these weren't entirely trustworthy after the infamous incident when a laundress saw something rise from her wash basin and ask for a kiss. Enter the mirror thieves. These were not ordinary criminals. They didn't steal jewels or coin. Their trade was in glass, specifically mirrors that had been properly exorcised, blessed, and certified harmless by the church. The process was expensive, requiring multiple priests and enough holy water to drown a small village, which meant sanctified mirrors fetched prices that would make a tax collector blush. Margot Leclerc, a former nun turned entrepreneur, ran the most successful operation. Her system was elegant. She paid grave robbers to steal mirrors from tombs, the logic being that anything buried with the dead was likely safe, then had them re-blessed by disgraced priests who worked for wine and the occasional chicken. The final product, a mirror guaranteed by 3 saints and Margot's own formidable reputation, sold for twice its weight in silver. Business was good, until the night Margot acquired a mirror that shouldn't have existed. It came from the catacombs beneath Saint-Denis, smuggled out by a digger with missing fingers and a tendency to weep at the sight of his own reflection. The mirror was small, oval, its frame tarnished silver blackened with age. What made it unusual was that it showed no reflection at all, just darkness. Margot, intrigued, paid the man double and sent him on his way. That was her first mistake. Her second was looking into it. The mirror didn't show her face. It didn't show anything recognizable as a reflection. Instead, it displayed a room, a perfect replica of her own workshop, but empty. The candles were unlit. The tools lay untouched. The air was still. Then, the door in the mirror opened. A figure stepped through. Margot would later describe it as almost human, if humans could be made of smoke and bad intentions. It moved toward the glass with terrifying purpose, its hands pressing against the surface from the other side. She covered the mirror at once with a black silk shroud, but the damage was done. That night her workshop burned to the ground. The fire was peculiar. It left the surrounding buildings untouched, consumed no flammable materials, and produced no smoke. It simply erased the structure, leaving behind only a fine gray powder and the mirror completely unharmed, lying in the ashes. Margot did what any sensible businesswoman would. She tripled the price and sold it to an Italian count with more money than sense. The count installed the mirror in his Venetian palazzo, where it became the star attraction of his weekly salons. Guests would dare each other to stare into its depths, laughing nervously when their reflections failed to appear. The count, delighted by his purchase, commissioned a poem about it. Then people started disappearing. First a maid, then a visiting diplomat, finally the count's own nephew. Each last seen standing before the mirror, each vanishing without a trace. The palazzo staff quit en masse. Local priests refused to enter the building. The count, stubborn to the end, hired armed guards to watch the mirror at all times. This proved ineffective when the guards began reporting that their reflections would sometimes stay behind when they walked away, waving mournfully from the glass. The final straw came when the count hosted a midnight gathering to commune with the other side. 20 brave souls attended. Only 19 left. The missing guest, a German baron with a fondness for dueling, was found 3 days later in a village 50 miles away. He was naked, dripping wet, and babbling about the city and the glass. When questioned, he claimed to have walked through the mirror into a Paris that wasn't Paris, where the streets twisted in impossible directions, and the people had no faces. The count had the mirror bricked up in a wall the next day. But brick, as it turns out, is no match for determined reflections. A month later, the count's valet reported hearing scratching from inside the wall. Then whispers. Then, one terrible night, singing. When workers finally tore down the bricks, they found the mirror untouched and the wall behind it gone, replaced by a dark corridor that smelled of roses and damp stone. No one dared enter. The mirror remains in Venice to this day, hidden in a secret room in a crumbling palazzo, its surface covered by a heavy velvet drape. The family that owns the building pays a local priest to perform monthly blessings. And if you listen very closely on quiet nights, you can still hear something on the other side of the glass. Something breathing. Something waiting. Something that has learned to knock. Chapter 14. The Physician's Warning. In the year 1689, Dr. Elias Whitaker published EJA treatise on the dangers of looking glasses and their pernicious effects upon humors of the body, a medical text that sent shockwaves through European society. Whitaker, a respected member of the Royal College of Physicians, had spent 20 years studying patients who owned mirrors, and his conclusions were damning. Of 100 melancholic cases observed, he wrote, 97 kept mirrors in their bedchambers. Of 50 consumptives, all were regular users of looking glasses, and in every instance of hysterical paralysis, the sufferer could trace their first symptoms to prolonged exposure to reflective surfaces. The medical establishment was divided. Some physicians dismissed Whitaker as a superstitious fool. Others quietly began covering their diagnostic mirrors between patients. The controversy might have remained academic were it not for Lady Charlotte Devereux, a celebrated beauty known for her hourly consultations with a hand mirror. Lady Devereux had begun wasting away in her 25th year. Her physicians bled her. They prescribed tinctures of gold and crushed pearls. They even attempted the then fashionable remedy of applying live pigeons to her feet. Nothing helped. When Whitaker was finally called, he took one look at the row of Venetian mirrors in her boudoir and ordered them all removed at once. Lady Devereux protested. "But how shall I know if I'm still beautiful? Whitaker's reply became famous. "Madam, if you must ask, the mirror has already won." Within a week of the mirror's removal, Lady Devereux's color returned. Within a month she could eat solid food again. By year's end, she had married a country squire who hated all reflective surfaces and lived to the remarkable age of 63, dying ironically when she slipped on a polished floor while trying to glimpse herself in a window. Whitaker's practice boomed. Wealthy patients paid exorbitant fees for his mirror purges, where he would personally supervise the removal and destruction of every reflective surface in their homes. The treatment always followed the same pattern. First the bedchamber mirrors, then the dining room accents, finally, and most dramatically for the vanity prone, the handheld glasses. Some patients reported immediate relief. Others experienced violent withdrawals, including the Duchess of Marlborough, who was found trying to lick her image from a soup tureen. The most disturbing cases were those Whitaker termed hollow men, patients who had spent so much time before mirrors that their reflections had grown stronger than they were. These unfortunates would fade when away from glass, becoming pale, insubstantial versions of themselves, only to regain vigor when allowed to gaze upon their reflections. Lord Pembroke, one such case, was reduced to carrying a small pocket mirror at all times, sneaking glances like a drunkard with a flask. When Whitaker confiscated it, the nobleman collapsed into a near catatonic state, whispering, "I'm disappearing, doctor. I can feel myself unraveling." Whitaker's most controversial theory involved childbirth. He claimed that pregnant women who looked into mirrors too often risked having their vital essence stolen by the glass, resulting in stillborn infants or, more horrifying, babies born with reflective eyes that showed not the nursery, but some other place entirely. This was too much even for his supporters. The College of Physicians formally censured him. The Church questioned his methods. His wealthy patients drifted away, unwilling to be associated with such scandalous ideas. Whitaker might have faded into obscurity had he not disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 1693. His last journal entry, written in a frantic hand, described an experiment in which he had covered every mirror in his house except one small hand glass, which he placed in a locked box. Day 37, the entry read, "Dort guide. The knocking grows louder. I believe it has learned my name. Tonight I shall—" The sentence ended mid-word. When servants broke down his chamber door, they found the room empty save for the box, its lock intact but its lid slightly ajar. Inside, the mirror lay shattered. On the floor nearby, perfectly preserved amid the shards, was Whitaker's reflection, his face frozen in a scream, his hands pressed against the inside of the glass. As for the good doctor himself, he was never seen again, though occasionally patients in London's finest houses would report catching sight of a pale, gaunt figure in their mirrors, just for an instant, before the image resolved into their own familiar face. The figure always appeared to be mouthing the same words. "Don't look away." Chapter 15. The Lover's Reflection. Geneviève d'Autrecourt was considered the most beautiful woman in Provence, until the winter she turned 23, when a fever left her face scarred and one eye milky white. Her fiancé dissolved their engagement. Her friends stopped inviting her to salons. Even her maids, who had once competed for the privilege of dressing her hair, now averted their eyes when helping her into simpler, higher-necked gowns. Only one thing remained unchanged: the massive cheval glass that had been her grandmother's wedding gift, its mercury-backed surface still showing Geneviève as she had been, flawless. At first, she used the mirror only to remember. She would stand before it for hours, tracing the air where her reflection's unmarred cheek curved smooth as porcelain. Then came the morning, when her reflection sighed and said, "You look so tired, darling." Geneviève should have been frightened. Instead, she wept with relief. Her reflection, who called herself Vivienne, was everything Geneviève had lost. Vivienne's skin was still luminous, her eyes still bright and mocking, her lips still quick to smile. She remembered all of Genevieve's favorite songs, could mimic every mannerism, even predicted when Genevieve's headaches would strike. "Because I know you better than anyone," Vivienne purred when Genevieve marveled at this. "Better than you know yourself." By spring, Genevieve refused all visitors. She took meals in her dressing room so Vivienne wouldn't dine alone. She had servants move the mirror to face her bed, claiming she couldn't sleep without watching over her reflection. When her remaining maids quit, whispering that Mademoiselle talked to the mirror more than she did to living souls, Genevieve didn't bother replacing them. She wasn't alone. The first time Vivienne stepped out of the glass, it was only for a moment, just long enough to adjust Genevieve's shawl when it slipped from her shoulders. Her touch was cool as water, her fingers leaving damp trails on the fabric. Genevieve, half mad with loneliness, kissed those phantom hands and begged her to stay. "Not yet," Vivienne murmured. "But soon." That night, Genevieve dreamed of drowning. She woke gasping, her sheets soaked, her hair dripping, her lungs burning as if she'd inhaled the sea. The mirror was fogged with condensation, and written in the mist were the words, "Je miss you when you're gone." The next evening, Vivienne emerged fully. She looked solid as any woman, though candlelight passed faintly through her, and her footprints left wet marks on the carpet. She could touch, but not be touched. Genevieve's hands slipped through her wrists like mist. "Does it hurt?" Genevieve asked once, watching Vivienne examine a vase of roses without disturbing the petals. Vivienne smiled her knife-blade smile. "Only when I pretend to be real." They developed rituals. Vivienne would brush Genevieve's hair with a comb that never quite caught the strands. Genevieve would read aloud while Vivienne mouthed the words, a heartbeat behind. In the gardens at twilight, they walked side by side, though only one cast a shadow. Then came the morning Genevieve woke to find Vivienne already dressed, standing by the window in a gown Genevieve didn't recognize. "I borrowed it," Vivienne said when asked. "You weren't using it." The gown was from the back of Genevieve's wardrobe, a forgotten favorite from before her illness. But something was different. Where Genevieve's scars had stretched the fabric of the collar, the cloth lay smooth. Genevieve said nothing. She began noticing other changes. Vivienne's hair curled slightly differently than hers had. Vivienne favored her left hand, though Genevieve was right-handed. And sometimes, when Vivienne thought Genevieve wasn't looking, her reflection showed not Genevieve's ruined face, but the beauty she'd once been. The worst was the coughing. It started in autumn, a dry rasp, whenever Genevieve breathed too deeply. The local physician diagnosed consumption and prescribed bed rest, but Genevieve knew the truth. She was coughing because Vivienne was. Each night, her reflection grew paler, thinner. Her perfect face now gaunt, her luminous eyes shadowed. "You're stealing my health," Genevieve accused one midnight, wiping blood from her lips. Vivienne, reflected in the window glass as rain sheeted down outside, didn't deny it. "Only what you gave me," she whispered. "Only what you wanted me to have." Genevieve smashed the cheval glass the next morning. Or tried to. The hammer bounced off as if striking stone. The fire she lit beneath it refused to catch. Even when she dragged it to the cliff above the sea, the mirror clung to her hands as if loath to let go. In the end, she covered it with a shroud and locked it in the attic. For a week, Genevieve's health improved. Then the dreams returned. Dreams of drowning, of cold hands stroking her face, of whispered endearments in a voice that wasn't quite hers. She woke each night gasping, her nightgown soaked, her sheets damp with seawater. The final night, she woke to singing. The mirror stood at the foot of her bed, its coverings torn away, its surface black as the ocean at midnight. Vivienne's voice drifted from the glass, sweet and familiar, singing the lullaby Genevieve's mother had crooned when she was small. Genevieve reached for the mirror. Vivienne's hand met hers halfway. This time, the touch held. They found Genevieve's body at dawn, her face pressed to the glass as if straining for one last kiss. The mirror showed only an empty room. But if you visit that seaside chateau on certain nights when the tide is high and the moon is full, you might see two figures walking the cliffs, one solid, one half transparent, their hands clasped tight, their faces turned toward the sea. And if you listen very closely, you might hear the waves whisper a name. Not Genevieve, not Vivienne, but something in between. Chapter 16. The Executioner's Mirror. In the year 1692, the city of Nuremberg introduced a new step in its execution protocol, one that had not been approved by any magistrate or council. It began quietly, as these things often do. The executioner, a gaunt man named Klaus Richter, brought a small handheld mirror to the scaffold when hanging a particularly unrepentant thief. As the noose was fitted around the man's neck, Richter forced him to look into the glass. "See yourself as God sees you," he intoned. The thief, who had laughed through his entire trial, took one glance and began screaming. He was still screaming when the trapdoor opened. No one could explain what he had seen. The mirror appeared ordinary, a simple circle of polished glass set in a tin frame, the kind any merchant's wife might carry. But from that day forward, Richter insisted every condemned person look into it before meeting their end. The results were disturbing in their consistency. Murderers saw their victims standing behind them in the glass, their wounds fresh and weeping. Blasphemers saw their own faces rotting, tongues blackening like spoiled meat. A counterfeiter watched helplessly as his reflection melted into liquid gold that pooled at the bottom of the mirror before solidifying into a screaming face not his own. Richter called it the truth glass. The prisoners called it something else. The mirror's origins were unknown, though Richter hinted he'd acquired it from an Italian torturer who claimed it had once belonged to the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. "It doesn't show what is," Richter told his apprentice, a pale youth named Hans. "It shows what AC should be." Hans, who had been raised on stories of demons and hellfire, didn't question this, not even when the mirror began changing. It started small. The tin frame tarnished overnight, developing intricate patterns that resembled screaming faces. The glass developed a faint red tint like diluted blood. Then came the morning. Hans caught his own reflection winking at him when Richter wasn't looking. He said nothing. Executioners did not admit to fear. The mirror's reputation grew. People came from neighboring towns to witness its power. Condemned prisoners offered confessions to crimes they hadn't been accused of, begging to be hanged without looking into the glass. One woman, sentenced to burn for witchcraft, clawed her own eyes out rather than face her reflection. Richter simply held the mirror before the bloody sockets until she began shrieking about the things in the flames. Then came the execution of Matthias the tanner. Matthias had killed 3 men in a drunken brawl, crushing their skulls with the hammer of his trade. He went to the scaffold laughing, boasting that hell would be warmer than Nuremberg in winter. When Richter produced the mirror, Matthias spat on it. The spittle froze instantly, forming a tiny, perfect icicle on the glass. Matthias looked and screamed, not the short, shocked screams of previous prisoners. This was a bottomless wail, the sound of a man seeing his soul unravel in real time. He thrashed so violently the guards had to hold him still, as Richter forced the mirror closer. "What do you see?" Richter demanded. Matthias's answer sent the crowd stumbling back. "You, I see you, all of you, every face you've ever shown me." The execution proceeded hastily after that, but as Matthias's body swung, something peculiar happened. The mirror fogged over as if breathed upon, and in the condensation appeared 3 words. "Turn me around." Richter, against all sense, obeyed. The back of the mirror, which had always been plain tin, now bore an intricate engraving, a scene of a crowded square where tiny figures hung from countless gallows. At the center stood a familiar silhouette, a tall, gaunt man holding something circular in his hands. Hans saw it first. "Master, that's you." Richter laughed it off, but that night he drank himself into a stupor. Hans, tasked with cleaning the tools, found the mirror whispering to itself in the darkness. The words were too low to make out, but the voice was unmistakable. Matthias the Tanner's. The next morning, Richter was dead. He had hanged himself from the beam where he'd dispatched so many others, his face frozen in an expression of abject terror. The mirror lay at his feet, its surface cracked down the middle. When Hans picked it up, his own reflection smiled sadly and said, "It's your turn now." The city council ordered the mirror destroyed. They tried melting it, crushing it, even tossing it into the river Pegnitz. It always returned by morning. Propped against the executioner's door, its cracks healed, its surface gleaming. Hans used it exactly once, on a pickpocket who'd stolen communion wafers. What the boy saw in the glass made him vomit, uncontrollably, until he choked to death before the noose could take him. That night, Hans packed his belongings and fled Nuremberg, taking nothing from his apprenticeship, except a single tin-framed mirror that now hangs in an unnamed village's church, where it is used once a year to show penitents the state of their soul. The current priest claims no one has ever looked into it twice. And if you visit Nuremberg's old execution square at midnight, locals will tell you you can sometimes see a tall, gaunt figure standing on the abandoned scaffold, holding something circular in his hands, waiting for the next condemned soul to come face their reflection. And their screams. Chapter 17. The Mirror as a Spy. In the winter of 1701, the court of Louis XIV was gripped by a peculiar paranoia. Whispers slithered through the gilded halls of Versailles, passed between silk-gloved hands and hidden beneath the rustle of petticoats. Secrets, once shared only in locked chambers or the shadowed corners of gardens, now seemed to spill into the open air like wine from a cracked goblet. The king's most private conversations were repeated back to him by foreign ambassadors. Lovers' trysts were discovered before the bedsheets had cooled. Even Cardinal Dubois, a man whose face betrayed nothing, had been caught in an unguarded moment of rage, though no one had been in the room with him at the time. The source of these betrayals was not a network of spies, nor a clever servant slipping letters beneath doors. It was something far simpler, and far more insidious. It was the mirrors. The Duc de Saint-Simon was the first to notice. A man of meticulous observation, he had long made a habit of studying the reflections of courtiers in Versailles' many looking-glasses. The way their faces twisted when they thought no one was watching. The flickers of contempt or desire they smoothed away before turning to speak. But one evening, while lingering near a particularly ornate mirror in the Hall of Mirrors itself, he realized something unsettling. The reflections were still talking when their owners had fallen silent. He saw it first with the Comtesse de Verrou. She stood near the mirror, fan fluttering, her lips pursed in polite disinterest as the Marquis de Dangeau droned on about taxation. But in the glass, her reflection leaned toward another woman's, its mouth moving rapidly, its eyes alight with gossip. When the real Comtesse noticed Saint-Simon watching, she went pale, because her reflection had not stopped whispering when she did. Then there was the incident with the Spanish envoy. The man had been deep in conversation with his aide, speaking in low, rapid Castilian, when Saint-Simon, observing from across the room, saw their reflections in a nearby mirror continue the conversation long after their lips had stilled. Worse, the reflections were speaking in French. Saint-Simon went to the king. Louis, ever pragmatic, listened in silence before summoning his chief minister. "Cover every mirror in the palace," he ordered. At once. But Versailles had over 300 mirrors. Some were small, tucked into private chambers. Others were vast, towering things that had taken years to craft and install. And a few, a very few, were already watching the king's men with something like amusement in their glassy depths. The first team of workmen sent to dismantle the mirrors in the Queen's apartments returned with their hands cut to ribbons, insisting the glass had resisted them, splintering into jagged edges no matter how carefully they tried to remove it. A maid tasked with draping a cloth over a mirror in the Duc d'Orléans' chambers was found hours later, sitting before the uncovered glass, her mouth moving silently, her eyes tracking conversations no one else could hear. When shaken, she merely whispered, "It's so much louder in there." Then came the morning when Louis himself, standing before his favorite mirror to adjust his cravat, caught his own reflection smiling at him, a smile he had not made. The reflection lifted a single finger to its lips. That afternoon the king ordered every mirror in Versailles smashed. It took a week. The smaller mirrors shattered easily, though servants claimed the glass shards sometimes skittered across the floor like living things. The larger ones proved more stubborn. The great mirrors in the Hall of Mirrors had to be wrapped in heavy drapes and struck with mallets, their surfaces cracking with sounds like laughter. The massive glass in the king's own bedchamber refused to break at all, until Louis struck it himself with a ceremonial sword, at which point it exploded outward, showering the room with fragments that left no cuts but hummed faintly when touched to the ear. In the aftermath, courtiers exchanged nervous glances, wondering if they had imagined it all. But the secrets stopped leaking. The private conversations remained private, and the Duc de Saint-Simon, who had started it all, found himself haunted by a single thought. If the mirrors of Versailles had been listening, what exactly had they been telling? The answer came months later, when a Bavarian diplomat was caught with a small circular mirror hidden in his coat. Under interrogation, he confessed that his master, the Elector of Bavaria, had been receiving detailed reports of the French court's inner workings for years. Reports, he claimed, came from a source within the glass. Louis had the man hanged, but not before one final, chilling exchange. "Why mirrors?" the king demanded. The diplomat smiled. "Because, Your Majesty, no one thinks to guard what they see every day. And if, in the years that followed, certain courtiers were observed avoiding their reflections a little too carefully, or if servants occasionally reported whispers from rooms where every mirror had been removed, well, some secrets even a king cannot silence, especially when they're written in glass." Chapter 18. The Last Unbroken Mirror. The village of Weidenfeld had always been a superstitious place. Nestled in a valley where the mist clung to the ground like a second skin, its people crossed themselves at the sight of black cats, nailed horseshoes above their doors, and whispered prayers before passing the old gallows at the crossroads. But their greatest fear was reserved for mirrors. The trouble began in the winter of 1711 when the miller's daughter, Anneliese, claimed her reflection had stopped copying her. At first her parents dismissed it as a child's fancy, until the morning they found her standing before the family's prized looking-glass, her palms pressed to the surface, her voice hoarse from screaming. Inside the mirror her reflection stood perfectly still, its head tilted, its lips sewn shut with what appeared to be black thread. By week's end, half the village had reported similar horrors. The baker saw his dead father staring back at him from a shop window. The midwife's hand mirror showed only empty rooms behind her, no matter where she stood. And young Thomas, the shepherd's boy, swore his reflection had crawled out of a rain barrel one evening and run laughing into the woods. So the village did what frightened people have always done. They destroyed what they feared. It began with handheld mirrors, shattered against hearthstones, tossed into the river, buried at crossroads with hawthorn branches to pin them down. Then came the larger glasses, ripped from walls and smashed in the square. The blacksmith even melted down the silvered backing of the inn's great mirror, pouring the molten metal into a bell that would later ring with an unsettling echo. Only one mirror remained, an ancient oval glass belonging to old Marta, the herb wife who lived at the forest's edge. "You'll bring doom on us all," the village priest warned when he came to demand it. Marta who had outlived 3 husbands and the plague of 82, merely smiled. "Break this one, and you'll regret it." They called her a witch. They called her worse. But no one dared touch the mirror, not after the tailor's apprentice tried and came back with his right hand withered like a dead leaf. Then the disappearances started. First the miller's daughter, who vanished from a locked room. Then the blacksmith's wife, gone between heartbeats as she drew water from the well. Finally, the priest himself, who had gone to Marta's cottage to perform an exorcism and was never seen again, though his voice could sometimes be heard, faint and pleading, from the direction of her chimney. The villagers gathered with torches and scythes. They would burn the cottage. They would destroy the mirror. They would. Old Marta met them at her gate, the mirror in her hands. "You fools," she said, her voice cracking like dry kindling. "You broke all the others. Where did you think the reflections would go?" She turned the mirror toward them. Where once it had shown only her wizened face, now it swarmed with figures. Dozens of them, pressed against the glass like fish in a frozen pond. The miller's daughter, her lips still stitched. The blacksmith's wife, her fingers tapping impatiently. The priest, his mouth stretched in a silent scream. And behind them, more faces. Some familiar, some strange, all watching the living with hungry eyes. The villagers fled. That night, Weidenfeld burned. Not from torches or lightning, but from the inside out, flames erupting from hearths and ovens, licking up walls but leaving the timber untouched. People screamed of cold fire that didn't burn skin, but turned their shadows to ash. By dawn, the village stood empty, its doors hanging open, its streets scattered with shattered glass. Only Marta remained, sitting on her porch, the unbroken mirror in her lap. If travelers passing through the valley dare to approach, she'll show them what the mirror sees now, a perfect reflection of Weidenfeld, its streets bustling, its inn bright with laughter. The miller's daughter skips rope. The blacksmith's wife sings as she works. The priest gives sermons to a congregation that never fidgets. And if you look very closely, you might notice something odd about the villagers' reflections, how they move just a little too freely, how their eyes follow you long after the real person has turned away. Marta never explains. She just smiles and polishes the glass with her sleeve. After all, every mirror needs someone to look into it. And Weidenfeld's reflections get so lonely. Chapter 19. The Modern Echo. The superstitions never really died. They simply changed shape, like reflections warping across uneven glass. The 17th century's terror of mirrors became the 18th century's uneasy suspicion, which faded into the 19th century's parlor game fascination, before resurfacing in the modern era as something between campfire tale and genuine unease. Consider the Bloody Mary ritual. Every child knows the rules. Stand in a darkened bathroom, light a candle, spin 3 times while chanting her name. The legend varies. Sometimes she's a witch, sometimes a ghost, sometimes a wronged woman searching for her lost child. But the mirror is always the doorway. Dr. Eleanor Shaw, professor of folklore at Cambridge, traces the earliest documented version to 1732 Lancashire, where girls would whisper Bloody Bess into hand mirrors to catch glimpses of their future husband. By 1800 the name had changed, and the stakes had risen. Now the reflection might show your death instead. The modern iteration, complete with its faux Latin chant, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, didn't solidify until a 1970s horror comic exaggerated the ritual for dramatic effect. But the core fear, Dr. Shaw notes in her unpublished manuscript Gaki Through a Glass Darkly, remains unchanged for 300 years. That something in the mirror might answer back. This terror takes subtler forms too. The widespread unease about mirrors in bedrooms isn't merely feng shui nonsense. It's the lingering echo of Renaissance warnings that mirrors could steal souls during sleep. The old Jewish custom of covering mirrors during mourning, meant to prevent the living from being tempted by vanity when contemplating mortality, has somehow transformed into New Age warnings about mirrors trapping grief energy. Even our language betrays us. We still describe narcissists as in love with their own reflection. We call deceptive people smoke and mirrors. When someone acts strangely, we say they're not themselves, implying, of course, that some other self might exist. The most telling evidence lies in our horror stories. Every culture has its mirror ghost tale. Japan has Ikagami Onna, the mirror woman who pulls victims into her glass prison. Mexico's Espíritus del Espejo whisper terrible truths to those who stare too long. Norway's Spillvandra are doppelgangers that mimic your movements a heartbeat too slow, waiting for the moment you'll glance away so they can act. Hollywood, ever the great synthesizer of nightmares, has exploited this fear relentlessly. From Imiros E to Hoculus, from AJ Candyman to VA Black Swan, the silver screen understands what our ancestors knew. Nothing is more terrifying than your own face betraying you. But the most disturbing cases aren't fictional. Take the 2004 incident at the Hotel Conrad in Vienna, where 17 guests reported seeing the same unfamiliar woman in their bathroom mirrors. Always standing just behind them, always mouthing words no one could hear. The hotel replaced every mirror in the building, only to have the reports resumed 6 months later. Security footage showed nothing unusual, save for one peculiar detail. In every clip where a guest reacted in terror, their reflection continued moving for a fraction of a second after they'd frozen. Or consider the infamous mirror box experiment conducted at the University of Toronto in 2011, where subjects placed in a mirrored isolation chamber began reporting phantom touches, whispering voices, and, in 3 cases, seeing their reflections aged decades in real time. The study was quietly shelved after participant hash 17 scratched the words "let me out" into her forearm while screaming that her reflection had switched places with her. Perhaps most telling is what happened when Google engineers trained an AI on millions of surveillance camera feeds to study human movement patterns. The system worked flawlessly until it began analyzing reflections in windows and mirrors. That's when we got anomalies, lead researcher Dr. Ian Cho admitted in a since-deleted blog post. Figures moving when no one was there. Gestures that didn't match the real person. Once, an entire conversation between 2 reflections while their originals stood silent. The project was discontinued. The blog post disappeared. When pressed, Cho would only say that some datasets shouldn't be scrutinized too closely. The truth is, we've never stopped fearing mirrors. We've just learned to dismiss the shiver down our spines when our reflection blinks a second too late. We laugh off the stories of people who swear they've seen something move in a mirror when no one was around. We tell ourselves it's just the light, just our imagination. Then there are nights like tonight, when you're alone in your bathroom, brushing your teeth, and you catch your reflection pausing a moment too long before copying you. When the glass feels colder than it should. When, for no reason at all, you suddenly remember your grandmother's warning never to have a mirror facing your bed. That's when you know. The old fears were right all along. The mirrors were never just showing us ourselves. They were showing us what else is here. And if you listen very carefully tonight as you turn off the light and hurry from the room, you might just hear the soft, satisfied sigh of something that knows you finally understood. Chapter 20. The Sleepwalker's Guide to Mirrors. Let it be known that no one in the 17th century actually needed a mirror. This was, after all, an era when personal hygiene was optional at best, when fashion meant wearing the same woolen sack until it rotted off your body, and when the concept of seeing your own face clearly was considered dangerously modern. And yet, against all common sense, people insisted on keeping these soul-stealing, demon-summoning, plague-spreading death traps in their homes. For those determined to flirt with damnation, here follows the only proper guide to mirror ownership in the year of our Lord 1699. First, never purchase a mirror from a merchant with fewer than 3 visible teeth. The correct number of missing teeth directly correlates with the merchant's ability to warn you about which mirrors are cursed. A fully toothed vendor is clearly in league with the devil, as evidenced by their suspiciously intact dentition and willingness to sell you a looking-glass that only sometimes shows your death. Upon acquiring your mirror, immediately have it blessed by no fewer than 7 priests. If the mirror laughs during the blessing, throw it into the nearest churchyard and pretend you never owned it. If the priests refuse to bless it, emigrate. The proper placement of mirrors is crucial. Never position one where it might reflect your bed, invites incubi. Your dinner table attracts gluttony demons. Or your children, who are already difficult enough to manage without their reflections developing independent personalities. Ideally, place your mirror in the home of an enemy, preferably near their valuables. Should your reflection begin acting independently, smirking when you frown, aging rapidly, or offering surprisingly good fashion advice, do not panic. Simply smear the glass with a mixture of holy water, crushed garlic, and the tears of a remorseful politician. If the reflection persists in its rebellion, remove the mirror to a darkened room and explain firmly that you are the original. And it is the copy. Should it argue, concede gracefully. Never look into a mirror at midnight, during a new moon, or on a Tuesday. Tuesdays were especially perilous in the 1600s, as this was when most mirrors held their weekly meetings to coordinate hauntings. If you must break a mirror, and really you must, the proper procedure involves wrapping it in black silk, reciting the Lord's Prayer backward, and burying it at a crossroads with a silver coin as apology. The coin is crucial, as it gives whatever lives in the mirror something to spend in hell. Should you encounter a mirror that shows not your reflection, but a room suspiciously similar to your own yet subtly wrong, perhaps the furniture is rearranged, or the windows look out on a different season, or there's a version of you that appears markedly happier, do not investigate. This is merely the mirror attempting to lure you into a better life. Smash it immediately, lest you be tempted by optimism. Finally, remember that all mirrors eventually turn against their owners. The family heirloom that has hung innocently above the hearth for generations, merely biding its time. The handheld glass your wife uses to pluck her chin hairs, counting your sins. Even the still pool of water in your garden trough is gathering evidence for the day it rises up to replace you. But take heart. Should you follow these guidelines, and really, you won't, you may enjoy up to 6 months of relatively safe mirror ownership before something crawls out and claims your firstborn, or your face, or your Tuesday afternoons. Happy reflecting.